Germany might be bringing back something most thought was gone for good: the military draft. And no, this isn't just some outdated policy dusted off for nostalgia. With unease rising across Europe and global threats stacking up, Berlin's move is raising serious eyebrows. The decision signals a major change in how Germany plans to protect its borders and respond to the changing world around it. And it might be just the beginning.
At a time when many European nations are discussing ways to boost defence spending, as President Trump says they need to pay more, Germany's voting on proposals to remove restrictions on borrowing so it can significantly increase its defence budget.
Germany has revealed its plans for what life in the country would look like during war with Russia.
We are investigating a step that you have already taken. We suspended conscription in 2011. Now we are looking into reactivating it, and we are looking at the Swedish model.
Is this just about boosting defense? Or is Germany quietly preparing for something much bigger? What's really going on behind the scenes, and why now? Let's break down what this could mean for Europe's future. Germany's next potential leaders didn't waste any time dusting off old playbooks. They kicked off with mandatory military service. In early March, conservatives from the CDU-CSU bloc, fresh off a major election win, made it crystal clear. They wanted boots on the ground and fast. Friedrich Merz, the man steering the bloc, argued that Europe could no longer rely on the US, especially not with Trump back in charge and cozying up to Russia like it was 2005 all over again. Time for the continent to hold its own, apparently. Merz didn't stop at defense. He took a red pen to Angela Merkel's legacy, including her 2011 decision to suspend compulsory service. Instead, he pushed for a modernized version. One compulsory year, where young people either served in the military or gave back through community work. Germany's armed forces, he said, were stretched too thin, and the reserves needed strengthening. Florian Hahn, the defense policy voice in Merz's alliance, also echoed what many had quietly been thinking. Ditching conscription over a decade ago no longer matched today's threat landscape. Speaking to Germany's Bild newspaper, he said the first batch of recruits should be marching into barracks by 2025, because standing still while the world grew more dangerous wasn't an option. Even though conscription had always sparked debates in Germany, support for bringing it back quietly gained traction across party lines this March. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, repping the Social Democrats under outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz, pushed to beef up the military, but with a twist. He backed a system rooted in volunteer service, but one flexible enough to flip the conscription switch if needed. The Scholz cabinet had already signed off on a plan back in November. The idea was to send every 18-year-old a questionnaire asking about their health and interest in joining the army. Boys had to respond. Girls were optional. After the forms rolled in, a select group would be called in for screening, and some would kick off a 6-month military stint, with a chance to stick around longer. Andre Wessner, who heads the German Armed Forces Association, wasn't shy about his opinion either. Speaking to Welt TV, he warned that if Germany didn't act fast, the military could hit a personnel crisis in 2025. The country needed to replace 27,000 people annually who were leaving the forces. Coalition talks between the CDU-CSU bloc and Social Democrats were also in motion, with Merz aiming to wrap things by Easter. Even Joschka Fischer, former foreign minister and Green Party heavyweight, was eating his words. He admitted that supporting the end of conscription had been a mistake, and now insisted it had to return for men and women alike. Without that move, he said, protecting Europe would be a losing battle. Germany has been no stranger to compulsory military service. It had been a fixture of national life since 1957. But in 2011, the government decided it was time to say goodbye to conscription. The plan was to give the Bundeswehr a major facelift, turning it into a lean, professional fighting force. It was the boldest rework of Germany's military, since it rose from the ashes after World War II. And it wasn't just about reform, it was also about saving money, a lot of money. About 8 billion euros was expected to be sliced off the defense budget as part of this move. Defense Minister Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, speaking at a military conference in Dresden, defended the decision, calling it both responsible and the right move. He wasn't winging it either. Military experts had been calling Germany's armed forces everything from outdated to downright ineffective. So change wasn't just nice, it was overdue. Gutenberg floated the idea of launching a new voluntary program that would welcome both men and women to serve for up to 23 months. It was a bit of a compromise aimed at softening the blow for those Germans who viewed conscription as sacred, a cornerstone of post-war Germany, even embedded in the Constitution. Still, Gutenberg admitted that this voluntary route wasn't exactly going to boost Germany's performance on international military missions. The roots of conscription went deep. The military had been founded in 1955, and bringing in mandatory service shortly after was seen as a safeguard, keeping the military close to civil society to avoid any repeat of the Nazi-era manipulation of a professional officer class. But over time, critics argued that this link to society had come at the expense of modernization. The old model just wasn't cutting it anymore. Chancellor Angela Merkel used the Dresden event to rally support, urging Germany's military leaders to embrace this overhaul. She called on them to be symbols of adaptability, saying they had a real chance to help shape a modern and strong Germany. She made it clear that this wasn't just a military update, it was a national moment. The political roadblock was already cleared by then. Earlier that fall, Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, CDU, and its sister party, the Christian Social Union, CSU, had both voted in favor of ending national service during their party conferences. They also threw their support behind turning the Bundeswehr into a fully professional army, which military planners had been pushing for, especially as a way to handle modern global missions more efficiently. Part of the plan involved trimming down the armed forces from 240,000 soldiers to just 163,500. But fewer boots on the ground didn't mean less global action. In fact, the aim was to double the number of troops ready for foreign missions from 7,000 to 14,000. Efficiency was the name of the game. Of course, removing conscription had ripple effects beyond the barracks. For decades, thousands of 18-year-olds who opted out of military service, either because of health issues or pacifist beliefs, had been sent off to work in hospitals and care homes. They'd become a crucial low-cost labor force in the social sector. Now, with national service going out the door, around 90,000 of these positions were expected to vanish, leaving a gaping hole in Germany's social care system. The government tried to cushion the impact, saying it would keep a voluntary program open for young people interested in social work. Officials insisted that the demand for post-high school, pre-university volunteering would still be there, even without mandatory service backing it up. Whether that would actually be enough to fill the gap, well, that was a different question entirely. But what's happening now? What's got Germany dusting off the barracks and measuring boots again? Russia's not just flexing anymore. It's in full beast mode when it comes to prepping for a potential showdown with Europe. That's what Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission boss, made very clear when she spoke at Denmark's Royal Military Academy. She basically pointed out that Moscow has been massively ramping up its military production. That investment, she warned, isn't just about Ukraine. It's laying the groundwork for possible future conflicts with European democracies. Why now? Because America, Europe's longtime ally, is busy looking westward, like really west, to the Indo-Pacific. So, Europe, yeah, they're on their own, and they know it. Von der Leyen emphasized that the old security system Europe once relied on is no longer a given. She said the world has firmly re-entered an era defined by power struggles and spheres of influence, like a geopolitical rerun with updated weapons. So, what's Europe doing? Well, they're not just sitting around, that's for sure. They're going full DIY defense mode, starting with Ukraine. There's talk of forming a new joint task force with Kiev, and plans are on the table to send 2 million artillery shells, air defense systems, and even some strike missiles their way this year. Von der Leyen even gave this defensive posture a nickname, the Steel Porcupine strategy. Basically, turn Ukraine into something so spiky and indigestible that Russia won't even think about taking another bite. And while Ukraine's getting armored up, Europe's doing some push-ups of its own. The EU is finally reaching into its wallet, planning to pump 800 billion euros into its own defense. 150 billion euros of that is loans just for the military sector. We're talking about new air defense systems and souped-up defense infrastructure across the entire EU club. All 27 EU countries gave a thumbs up to the plan, dubbed ReArm Europe. The goal is to make the whole continent look less like a sitting duck, and more like, well, a porcupine with laser cannons. As of March 21st, the European Union finally got its act together and agreed. By 2030, the EU should be fully locked, loaded, and ready to defend itself from a potential Russian attack. It took a bit of squabbling to get there. Some EU countries needed more convincing than others, but according to Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, everyone's now on board, some reluctantly, but still on board. Europe's sudden defense hustle isn't random. The mood across the continent is shifting fast, mostly because the United States, the post-WTO security blanket, is, as I said earlier, clearly eyeing the Indo-Pacific these days. That shift has EU leaders wondering if they'll need to start looking after themselves, rather than dialing Washington every time things get tense. But not every country in the EU has the same sense of urgency, especially the ones far from Russia's neighborhood. Tusk explained that behind closed doors at the summit, there were definitely some feelings, particularly from countries that haven't exactly been spending big on their military. He pointed out that a few of the larger EU states still barely open their wallets for defense, and as of now, they're not super eager to change that. The numbers don't lie. NATO member Spain spent just 1.28% of its GDP on defense in 2024, and Italy came in at 1.49%. That's well below NATO's 2% goal, even after 3 years of war in Ukraine, and repeated nudges from the US to raise the bar. Slovenia, Belgium, and Portugal are in the same lightweight category, spending between 1.29% and 1.55% of GDP. Italy says it'll bump its spending to 1.6% by 2027, while Spain has circled sometime before 2029 to finally hit that 1.5% of GDP 2% target. So, progress, just not at Formula One speed. Tusk said that Poland, Denmark, and Sweden shared a very different view. The more ground Russia gains now, the faster Europe needs to move. He announced that the European Council had officially embraced the goal of having full-scale defense capabilities by 2030. And not just a little stronger, he made it clear that by then, Europe must be militarily and technologically superior to Russia, not tied, not neck and neck, clearly stronger. He tied the 5-year timeline to an analysis from NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte, who warned that Russia could rebuild its offensive capabilities by around 2030, after burning through a good chunk of them in Ukraine. So, the clock is ticking. That said, Tusk emphasized this didn't mean Europe was bracing for an actual Russian attack in 2030. He said it was more about deterrence than battle plans. In his words, the key wasn't just having weapons, it was about showing through real decisions and action that Putin's Russia wouldn't stand a chance against a united, well-armed Europe. That, he said, was the only real way to keep war off the table. Germany isn't the only country with a thing for mandatory military service. Turns out, a bunch of European nations still make their young citizens trade sneakers for boots, at least for a few months. Now, Croatia's hopping back on that train. Starting in mid-2025, it plans to bring back conscription, a move confirmed by Defense Minister Ivan Anušić, which places it among a select group of NATO countries that still stick to some form of compulsory service. The policy will apply to Croatian men, who will be expected to fulfill what the government's calling a national duty. Anušić pointed out that the military has had a bit of a glow-up lately. Better pay, improved conditions, new gear, and upgraded infrastructure, all in line with NATO expectations. The goal, he said, is to build a more capable and efficient fighting force in the near future. Not everyone in Croatia is cheering. The backlash hasn't really been about the military aspect itself, but more about the country's budget deficit. Critics are raising their eyebrows at the cost of it all, but Anušić said the government isn't planning to trim the defense budget anytime soon, especially with current security concerns in play. Croatia, after all, had scrapped mandatory service back in 2008 when it switched to a professional army, just before joining NATO in 2009. Now, of the 18,000 or so Croatians turning 18 each year, around 4,000 to 4,500 are expected to enter the armed forces under the Revive program. Those who don't want to serve in the military will be offered a civilian alternative, 4 months working in disaster response, infrastructure projects, or social services. Women won't be required to serve, but can volunteer if they choose. The Croatian government is also aiming to hit NATO's defense spending target of 2% of GDP by 2027, 3 years ahead of the deadline. Right now, Croatia's defense budget sits at 1.8 billion euros, which is roughly 1.9% of GDP. That's a 122% jump from 2016, so they've clearly been hitting the gas. Across Europe, this whole military service idea is still very much alive and kicking, though the rules vary widely. Norway, for example, makes both men and women register, but only a selected few end up doing the full 12-month service. Sweden reintroduced mandatory service in 2017, requiring all adults over 18, regardless of gender, to serve 11 months. In Finland, all men have to serve anywhere from 165 to 347 days, depending on their training track. Women can sign up too, but it's optional. Denmark also keeps it mandatory for men, ranging from 4 to 12 months, depending on where they're placed. Women, again, can join voluntarily. Switzerland makes its men put in 21 weeks of basic training, with women having the option to join if they want. Over in Greece, the military expects all men aged 19 to 45 to put in 9 months of army service, or 12 if they choose the Navy or Air Force. Austria lets its men choose between 6 months in uniform or 9 months of civilian service. Estonia requires men to serve between 8 and 11 months, while women can step in voluntarily. Lithuania brought back conscription in 2015 for men aged 19 to 26, who now serve for 9 months. Cyprus expects all men to serve for 14 months. Turkey asks men over 20 to complete a 12-month stint. For all of these countries, conscription is still seen as a key part of national defense, and not just about building armies. It's also a way to train the population to step in during emergencies, whether military or civil. Spain's taken a different approach. It's split military and civilian missions into neat, separate categories. But there's still ongoing debate about whether a few weeks of mandatory service and occasional retraining might not be such a bad idea. Some even argue that if young people got a small taste of military life, a few might end up sticking around, not because they have to, but because they want to.